Thank you for coming to my third and last lecture in this series on Afrikaner history. Tonight's topic is the border war. The South African border war, also known as the Namibian War of Independence, was a 23-year-long conflict on the border of Namibia and Angola. And there were numerous incursions into Angola itself. It was closely related to the Angolan Civil War, and it is an example of a Cold War proxy war. So the Cold War is known as a Cold War because the two main powers in the world at that time, so the Soviet Union and the United States, did not actually clash. However, they were involved behind the scenes in many localized conflicts across the globe. So throughout this lecture, if you can just please keep in mind that all of this is happening within the context of the Cold War. Let's quickly take a look at Africa at the beginning of the 20th century, right before the First World War. We just need to know three countries. The Union of South Africa, which was British. Above this we have Southwest Africa, green, which means it belonged to the German Empire, and the neighbor in the north, Angola, purple, meaning that it was under Portuguese control. So when World War I came, it began as a European conflict, but because Europe had Africa divided between themselves, the colonies in Africa, like in the rest of the world, were automatically pulled into the conflict, and that's why it's called the World War, because the entire world was actually at war because of European nations fighting each other. So if you remember from last week, the Southwest Africa campaign was Louis Botha's campaign when he was ordered by London to attack the German colony of Southwest Africa. The campaign took a few months, and by the middle of 1915, Germans surrendered in Southwest Africa, and it was under South African control until the end of the war. Then when World War I ended in 1918, we have the Treaty of Versailles, which, even though the war ended in an armistice, it treated Germany as a losing side, and it stripped Germany of a lot of its power, including all of its overseas territories. This, of course, included Southwest Africa. And the future of these territories was going to be decided by the League of Nations. So the League of Nations organized a system of, or this mandate system, where former German colonies were administered by areas that were adjacent to it, or closest to it. Some of the Pacific Islands were controlled by Australia or New Zealand, which is not close to anything. But Southwest Africa was going to be, would become the responsibility of South Africa. Now, the idea of a League of Nations mandate was that South Africa had the responsibility to develop the territory for the benefit of the native population without annexing the territory into its own borders. However, the laws that were passed in Cape Town for South Africa would be applicable to Southwest Africa as well. Okay, let's jump quite a few years to the end of the Second World War. The League of Nations stopped existing, and we have the creation of the United Nations. I know last week I mentioned a little bit about it, and I won't be going into too much detail today either, but What happened to the territories like Southwest Africa, so former German colonies that became League of Nations mandates, now became the responsibility of the United Nations, and they were under United Nations trusteeship. That meant that they would become independent as soon as the opportunity arose. Now, this is 1946, and South Africa refuses to hand over Southwest Africa to the United Nations or to grant it independence. It became a de facto fifth province of South Africa, like the Cape or the Free State. And this can be seen by the mere fact that since 1950, Southwest Africans, the white population, could vote in elections that elected representatives to the South African Parliament in Cape Town. As a side note, it was always a National Party candidate. In 1968, South Africa, the government of South Africa, which was already busy with implementing the separate development idea in South Africa, began to do so in Southwest Africa as well. There's going to be a lot of South Africa in this lecture, but I choose not to use the word Namibia until it became Namibia. So, yes, so Southwest Africa was also experiencing the division of land and the population in the so-called homelands. As you can imagine, there was opposition to that. And there were many liberation movements that wanted to, for Southwest Africa to become Namibia and gain independence. But we will focus only on Southwest Africa's People Organization, or SWAPO. This was an organization that formed from the Ovambo People's Congress, which was opposed to the migrant labor system in the area, and even though it transformed into this organization that supposedly incorporated all the people of Southwest Africa, it remained mainly an Ovambo dominated organization. In 1961, it already had two branches. It had the internal branch, which was a legal political party within Southwest Africa, and an external wing, which was either first in Tanzania and then in Zambia, and they were responsible for, SWAPO's, let's say, international relations, so getting support from other countries, and of course launching an armed struggle. This photo is a photo of Sam Nujoma, who is the president of SWAPO. He was abroad for most of the time period that we're talking about. And in 1990, when Southwest Africa became Namibia, he was the first president. Before we get into the war itself, let's take a quick look at the vague political timeline. So to understand the international attitude towards this whole issue, that we can look at the United Nations resolutions. So there were two types, the General Assembly and the Security Council. Now, the General Assembly is basically, it's all the representatives of all the member states. When they make a resolution, it tells us what the world thought, but it was not a binding decision. This meant that you can ignore it, but at least you know where you stand with the other member states. The Security Council is a group of temporary members that change every year, and then 5 permanent members. The US, the UK, France, China. Today it's Russia, and at the time of the border war it was the Soviet Union. Those people, or those countries, are always there, they have the right to veto any resolution that comes their way, and these resolutions are binding. Binding in the sense that if you don't adhere to them, there can be repercussions, economic sanctions, even military intervention. However, South Africa didn't really care and ignored all of these. So, okay, let's take a look. In 1966, the General Assembly terminated South Africa's mandate over Southwest Africa. South Africa ignored that and ignored the next one, so the binding one of 1969, when the Security Council said that their administration was illegal. Administration meaning also that the soldiers that were posted at the border and throughout Namibia, Southwest Africa, were there illegally. The next resolution, the General Assembly resolution in 1973, I'm not giving you all the numbers because if you want to, I'll just send them to you. I figure it's way too many numbers on the screen if I give you the specifics. So in 1973, SWAPO was recognized as the authentic representative of the Namibian people. So you see already, not Southwest African people, Namibian. So the United Nations already decided that Southwest Africa is Namibia and the country's sole representative is SWAPO, not the other liberation movements that also existed at that time. This is just important to know. During the border war, how much support SWAPO actually had and how much criticism South Africa received for fighting them. 1976, the Security Council demands free elections under UN supervision, and a year later, or 2 years later, the General Assembly appeals to its member states to support SWAPO in intensifying the liberation struggle. So basically, an invitation to support an escalation of the conflict. Now, 1976, when the UN demanded supervised free elections, it's not a coincidence that it happened then. Between 1975 and 77, we had the Turnhala Constitutional Conference, which was South Africa's way of trying to deal with the problem of Southwest Africa. I will mention it at the end, but this is where you can start seeing that South African politicians were realizing this cannot go on forever. So they had the idea of organizing a government of national unity and holding elections in 1978, which were actually universal elections, so universal franchise. That means that people of all races could vote. The winning party was the Democratic Turnhala Alliance, which was a multiracial party. However, since it was not recognized internationally, the government was not very successful, and by 1983, Southwest Africa was back under the administration of South Africa. So that's a little bit of politics. Okay, the border war started in 1966, ended in 1989, and it can be divided into two episodes, let's say. The first one would be 1966 to 1975, and it started with, so the guy that I showed you a few slides ago, Sam Nujoma, he established the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, or CLAN, and the beginning of the war is considered to have happened with the attack on a border post in Oshipango, which is around here. It is in Ovambo land, which, you know, SWAPO was Ovambo, kind of makes sense. So this was the first infiltration in August of 1966. And even though this was the first skirmish, the main, the area that the South African force had to focus on during this time period was actually the Caprivi region. Now, I think if we turned off the lights, it would be visible a little bit better, but if you don't see it, trust me. You have Angola for the majority of this map, and then the Caprivi region is where Southwest Africa bordered Zambia. Now, Zambia was not too friendly with South Africa, so it was much easier for SWAPO to infiltrate Southwest Africa through Zambia than through Angola. Why Angola? Because of the Portuguese. So Angola was still Portuguese, and the Portuguese military cooperated often with the South Africans to prevent SWAPO infiltrations into Southwest Africa. They shared intelligence, but also the Portuguese were very busy with their with fighting Angolan liberation movements. So let's say they were in the area. So instead of patrolling 1,400 kilometers, South Africa had to focus on the Caprivi Strip, which was 230. Now, in 1967, Parliament in Cape Town passes the Defence Amendment Act, which introduced conscription, and during the entire border war, you had about 320,000 men sent to that border. More were, of course, taken into the military service, but out of those, 320 actually served at one point or another for various lengths of time on the border with Angola. Okay, I mentioned Portuguese cooperation, so let's look at what was happening in Angola at that time. We have three main liberation movements that were fighting the Portuguese for Angola to gain independence from them. We have the MPLA, which stands for the Portuguese version of People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola. They represented the Mbundu people. They were led by Agostinho Neto, and they had a communist ideology. We also have the FNLA, which in Portuguese expands to the National Front for the Liberation of Angola. So People's Movement and National Front for the Liberation of Angola. And they were the Bakongo people, led by Holden Roberto, and they were actually they were in the center-right of the political spectrum. So they were a much better option for the free world. So anyone against communism, so like South Africa, the US, they were the go-to person. And then we have UNITA, which was led by Jonas Savimbi. Yes, UNITA stands for the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola. And those were people of the Ovibundu tribe. And their ideology changed. Until 1975, they were Chinese communists. So MPLA is Russian communist. UNITA was Chinese communist. And then in 1975, they realized it wasn't a unique situation in remote places like Africa or Asia that movement would change its ideology. They changed it to basically anti-communist. That's actually what they saw themselves as. Now, why they would change? It's not that their ideology was a matter of conviction, it was more of opportunity. So first, they believed that they will be better off if they get support from China. Later they realized it will be better if they ask the US for help. So UNITA became anti-communist, and this movement will come up several times from now on. In 1975, this is where one episode of the border war ends and the escalated conflict starts. And this happened in 1975 because of what was happening in Portugal. So in 1974, Portugal experienced the Carnation Revolution, which marked an end to the decades of authoritarian rule and started the democratic Portugal. When this happened, Portugal announced that they will be leaving Angola. They announced that they will be leaving on the 11th of November 1975. The problem was they did not make any plans for the transfer of power. They just said, we're leaving on that day, which was bound to become a very chaotic time until that day. And we have the beginning of the Angola Civil War. So from 1961, they have the War of Independence. They're basically fighting until 2002, but this is where the idea changes. They already know they're getting independence, so now they're just fighting for the control of the new independent country. So there were two possible outcomes. Either the FNLA or the UNITA, but the FNLA was had a greater chance, gets Luanda, the capital, and South Africa can be quite certain that the new government in Luanda will cooperate with them. So even though things will be different, they don't have to worry too much because, like the Portuguese, FNLA will not allow SWAPO to establish bases in Angola. Or the MPLA, the communistic movement, will gain control of Luanda, and as the new government of Angola, South Africa was pretty sure that they will be cooperating with SWAPO. So, surprisingly, it was not just South Africa that was worried about this. Zambia, Zaire, which today is the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the US actually asked South Africa to intervene. So this is how we get to the beginning of the second part of the border war, Operation Savannah. So Operation Savannah, 1975, was the first incursion deep into Angola by South African forces. South Africa invaded from the south, obviously, and was marching to Luanda, along with UNITA, since UNITA was in control of areas south of Luanda, and they got to about 120 kilometers south of Luanda. So the South African forces, well, they went in pretty far. While the politicians were maintaining that there are no South Africans in Angola. But they were there for several weeks, and they were very, very close to the capital. And the idea was that South Africa with UNITA walks up north, while the FNLA, so the center-right movement that the US was in favor of, led by Holden Roberto, would come from the north and defeat the MPLA. However, the day before, the 11th of November, so the day before the big transfer of power, Holden Roberto lost to the MPLA, and the MPLA, which had support in that area, and it was the only liberation movement in Luanda when the Portuguese left, automatically got the control over the country. they were also recognized internationally. So once you get recognized internationally, you don't really have a motivation to negotiate with your fellow countrymen who are also claiming to deserve a seat in government. The MPLA ruling Angola will continue to fight the other two movements. The FNLA, not for long. It basically, after 1975, it was defeated and it disappeared from the scene. UNITA, like I said, until 2002. So the South Africans began to retreat at the beginning of 1976. And as a nationalist editor described this, I don't know if you heard the name Schalk Pienaar, but Schalk Pienaar humorously described this entire operation as a tiny little mistake. So this situation in Angola changed the border war because SWAPO's struggle became a tripartite effort, meaning that Angola was providing the location. SWAPO could set up their bases without any interference from the government. And like I pointed out, right across the border, a very long border, was Southwest Africa. The Soviet Union provided weapons and advisors, military advisors, while Cuba, which if you will remember, it was also communistic, provided instructors, soldiers basically, and the number of Cuban soldiers rose dramatically. So in 1977, there were 13,000 of them. In 1983, so 6 years later, 25,000. And in 1986, 45,000. Some sources say there were 50, some say there were 60,000 at the end of the war. So it was a pretty significant amount of people, or number of people. They were not all there to help SWAPO per se. They were there to help the MPLA, which was still fighting UNITA, but they were very involved in some of the battles with South Africans. We cannot talk about every single operation, well, there were really a lot of them during the war. So as an example of what the war looked like, I chose Operation Reindeer, which occurred in 1978. If you ever ask me about what got me into South African history, you have heard the name Cassinga. So let me tell you about the attack on Cassinga. 1978, the South African government and SWAPO agreed to negotiations in New York City, and they were going to take place on the 8th of May. So a few days before that, let me take you back a few weeks before that, the military was thinking of, okay, how do we make negotiations easier for our politicians? Well, one obvious way is to take away or prevent SWAPO from threatening to use force if their demands are not met. So how do you do that? Well, you destroy their bases, which are in Angola. The Operation Reindeer, I love that name, by the way, because in Africa, like, why reindeer? Out of all the names, this one is by far the strangest one. The operation was scheduled for the 4th of May, so 4 days before the negotiations. The objective was to destroy 28 bases in southern Angola. Yes, Kasinga is around that, around where the arrow is pointing. It's 250 kilometers into Angola. So 28 bases to be destroyed. Among them, their main headquarters in southern Angola, Kasinga, by the plan or SWAPO, called Moscow, and the other bases were easier to destroy because they were closer to the border. So you just had mechanized units drive into Angola and just, well, okay, let me explain how it happened with Kasinga, then you'll understand why the other ones were less of a problem. So Kasinga, 250 kilometers into Angola, you can't exactly drive there and expect no one to notice. So South Africans sent bombers, bombed the place, then sent 377 paratroopers. The paratroopers were on the ground for, I think, about 6 hours. As you can imagine, no military operation ever goes according to plan. So if you're interested in how everything went wrong, I will let you know when we meet personally. But they actually managed to retreat. Again, had airplanes come in, pick up their paratroopers. And after the Cubans were stationed nearby, and they noticed that suddenly there's a lot of smoke coming up and everything, so they got involved, so they were being bombed, and at the end of the day, you had about 608 Namibians. They consider themselves Namibians, so I will call them Namibians. Namibians that died, 150 Cubans, and 4 South Africans. What happens next is it's again not unique for this type of war, which you can win militarily, but if you cannot win the propaganda war that follows, it's going to be a loss. So the propaganda war is the most, it's an extremely interesting part of this war. Interestingly enough, it continues to this day. So the South African military thought that if they deal SWAPO such a blow, so 28 of their bases, including their main headquarters, if they are destroyed in one day, right before negotiations, there's no way that SWAPO will tell the world, oh hey, we just got, I can't use the slang word for this, we just got annihilated, because then the Soviet Union will just step back and say, well, you're clearly not strong enough to even attempt to support because you have no chances, so they'll come back. So the South Africans decided that they will not tell anyone what they did, because SWAPO won't tell anyone either, but the objective will have been reached because it would be impossible for them to infiltrate Southwest Africa in the process of the negotiations. Now, they were a little bit right in the sense that SWAPO never admitted to losing 28 bases that day. What they did do, however, blowed everyone's minds, or all the South African minds, because that evening on the Angolan radio, people heard that the South African military attacked and massacred, that's why I couldn't say that they got massacred, they massacred Namibian refugees. So they definitely admitted to South Africans being there. However, they twisted the story extremely by claiming that it was a refugee camp. There were just a few militants just to defend the camp, and basically this is an atrocity, huge human rights violation, and South Africa is not only racist, but also, well, I'm not sure there's one word to describe it, but well, capable of massacring innocent people. Now, if you think about guerrilla type war, the line between a militant and a civilian, if it exists, is extremely thin. So it is very, it happens very often that, well, first of all, you don't have uniforms, so you can be a very well-trained soldier of the militant group that is not wearing a uniform. And then if someone comes and shoots at you, you're shooting back, but then when you die, they claim that no, but he wasn't wearing a uniform, he was not a soldier, he was simply a civilian. Another thing you have to remember is that with a war like that, it is very possible that refugees that came from Namibia into Angola stopped over at a military base before they were moved to a safer place. So it is possible that there were civilians at Cassinga. However, as the South African military pointed out, all the proof suggests that, or well, first let me say that the South African military did admit that there could have been a few civilians that were shot, but they explained that, first of all, in all the reconnaissance, there was absolutely no sign that it was a refugee camp, which, given the, even back then, if you do aerial photos and you see, you know, anti-aircraft machines, it kind of suggests it's a military base and not a refugee camp. And all the documents that they found at that camp also proved that it was definitely a military headquarters. However, Namibians until this day maintain that this was just a refugee camp, and they are not being persuaded otherwise. Part of this propaganda war was, of course, the inclusion of, or the involvement of international journalists who, if you read closely, they came to Cassinga after the fact, and they were being shown around, and they were being they were shown because this is a few days later, so the graves, there were two main graves, mass graves for all the victims, and they were shown only one, which showed, I don't remember, but it was either one or, well, definitely not, like, it was very clear that most of the bodies were wearing uniforms, and there was like one colorful dress on a woman or something. And surprisingly, the second grave was never shown to anyone. So those that kind of understood how a propaganda war works already then assumed that, or claimed that the Angolans and Namibians and Cubans were twisting the truth. Okay. So the war began to end in 1988 with the New York Accords. What is vital here is that it was, okay, so it was orchestrated by the US, these negotiations, and the participants were South Africa, Angola, and Cuba. Now, if you notice, SWAPO is not a participant. So the reason the reason South Africa was willing to start negotiating at that time was that both Angola and Cuba agreed that Cubans will start withdrawing from Angola. So South Africa decided that if that happens, then South Africa is willing to start withdrawing from Angola and Namibia. And if you remember, a decade earlier, South Africa had the Turinhala elections, and I said that this kind of shows that they were already starting to think that this will not last forever. Well, this was, so this explains why 12 years later, or well, 10 years after the elections, they were ready to, when their demands for the end of Cuban presence in Africa was met, that they were willing to withdraw from Southwest Africa as well. The official end of the war in 1989 is occurred because of that systematic withdrawal, as well as the presence of the UN Transition Assistance Group, which was meant to observe, supervise, and make sure everyone is doing what they're supposed to be doing. There was an interesting incident, since SWAPO was not part of the deals. SWAPO did not feel like they needed to follow the agreed to rules. SWAPO claims that it was again just refugees that were crossing the border, and they wanted to meet up with UN representatives, but there was an exchange of fire with the South Africans, and the threat of prolonging the conflict was there, but luckily Angola, which also shows how tired Angola was of all of this, made sure that all SWAPO returned to, they said the 16th parallel. I tried to check, I can't show you on the map here, but it's probably around where the word Angola is. So Angola was really set on ending this conflict. And the first elections that were internationally supervised occurred in November of 1989, and Namibia became Namibia, or Southwest Africa became Namibia, on the 21st of March 1990. Sam Nujoma, like I said at the beginning, became the first president. So, why did the war that lasted 23 years end right then? Well, the big picture in the world at that time was that the Cold War was ending. The Soviet Union was falling apart, which had enormous repercussions throughout the world. So if you remember the idea of proxy wars, if the Soviet Union is falling apart, then liberation movements, such as the ANC, for example, are aware that their funding will disappear. So they are more likely to agree to negotiations. Another aspect of this is that the nationalist government stopped being so afraid of a communist takeover of southern Africa, because, again, the Soviet Union is falling apart. So, and the fact that the Cubans were willing to get themselves out of Africa and go back to Cuba also removed that threat of a military communist takeover. The fact that I mentioned earlier that the South African politicians were quite aware that this has to end at some point, along with Angola being in a state of war since 1961, so this is 28 years, kind of all fit together perfectly and allowed for the three major players to come together and negotiate an end up to all of this. Like I mentioned with Angola, did not really come. I mean, they did get rid of SWAPO, but the MPLA would continue to have military or would continue to fight UNITA until 2002 when they killed Savimbi. A few days later, his successor died, so the third person in line was also pretty ready to sit down and actually start negotiating. Like in any war, we can look at the military aspect, which I know I did not do much today. We can look at the political, but I would like to end off with just a broad, quick look at the social impact. Like I said, about 320 men went to the border. So you have 320 people that were affected by this conflict, plus their families. So this is not just Afrikaner, not even just white South Africans. This conflict involved South Africans of various races. So the number of people that were somehow affected by this is immense. And during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so in the middle of the 1990s, there was one testimony which spoke about this universality of the experience. Though obviously each case is different, but let me just read you what they said. The old society did not provide for any process of reintegration and failed to acknowledge their sacrifice, of the soldiers' sacrifice. The new society condemns them as perpetrators, as defenders of apartheid. Now this was 1996. Unfortunately, this was reiterated in 2004 when in Pretoria the Freedom Park was opened. It's not a very popular place, but if you know where the Voortrekker Monument is, if you look at the hill across from that, you will see tall poles standing there. That's Freedom Park. And Freedom Park includes a wall of names, which is the top photo. It's actually several walls, a separate wall for a separate conflict that built South Africa, or shaped South Africa rather, and the names of people that perished in that conflict is written on the side of the wall. So I know this lighting is not permitting you to see it in detail, but on this side you have this big plaque. That's where it says which war it is, and then on this side, if you walk along, you can see the names of the people, and I think the date of when they died, or their age. I'm not entirely sure. I think it's the date. So it's a wonderful idea. It is an idea that is not unique to South Africa. We saw it in Argentina as well. But why I say that this idea was reiterated, that they were defenders of apartheid, is that if you look at the newest conflict, you will find liberation movement members that perished, that are remembered there. You will find Cuban soldiers that were in Angola that died there, also remembered there, but you will not find the members of the South African Defense Force that died during this conflict. And for this reason, when you're at the Voortrekker Monument, you may want to take a walk around and notice all the monuments that are there, including a wall of remembrance with the names of those people that perished. So it is quite sad that in the 20th century when this huge new endeavor was taken up to build a freedom park with a beautiful name, and the idea of reconciling that this decision was made. And lastly, we are running out of time as well, so perfect timing. Because we can look at this big picture, but it is always good to just remember that each of those people was an individual with a family. The testimony also at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the testimony of a mother that lost her son. In the, let me quickly do the math, it would have been around 1987, so right before the, in the last months of the war. She said that my son was brought home wrapped in a thick sealed plastic bag. The instruction was that the plastic bag should not be opened. A part of me wonders if in fact it was him in that plastic bag. For 9 years, this mother was not certain, because she never saw the body of her son, if he really was dead. She admitted that she will walk down the street and think that she sees him, but it's just a person that looked similar. Luckily, after hearing this testimony, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee organized a meeting between her and someone that was actually there when her son died. And after 10 or 9 years, after 9 years of knowing that the army said that he died and going through the funeral and everything, it was only after 9 years that she actually accepted that her son died. There was no room to mention it earlier, but it will explain this. It will explain quickly in one sentence this occurrence, that this wasn't unique. This was not a single case. What unfortunately happened, because of the nature of this conflict, or the nature of the border war, which was in great part a secret war, was that often the deaths were recorded as died due to an accident in training. This led certain people to comment that the South African military was the most accident-prone army in the world, because so many people died, and all of them are dying in an accident. So the social impact of the border war, again, 23 years. So a lot of us here, I think half, if I do my math quickly, counting quickly, are just above 23. So basically our entire lives, year after year, you had people going to the war, living through the trauma, and their families either living through the trauma of not having them and not knowing what's going on, or through the trauma of losing them far away and not knowing the details of how it happened. So I hope this gives you I know it's just an overview, but enough of an overview to interest you to go and do a little bit of your own research, or ask me a few questions whenever you come up with them. So thanks.